What it is, what it was, what it shall be. We're back again. Today's video is called Spirit War Boot Camp number 117, and this is entitled The Serpent Seed. How's everyone doing? So as usual, we're trying to continue on from our previous video, and in the last video we were talking about biofield data storage, and believe it or not, that's related to this. So I briefly made mention of a Nobel Prize winning scientist called Luc Montagnier, who's very controversial for some reason, as a lot of these high-level scientists will suddenly become controversial if they pursue certain avenues of research. And interestingly, these so-called controversial fields of research happen to often be the exact things that the elites themselves are researching at a high level, and they don't want this to become public. Epstein being a most obvious example that lots of people will know about is his obsession with genetic research and hybridization, which I've made brief references to in our previous videos. A lot of people have been making mention of his purchase and interest in the works of Aleister Crowley, and the fact that the Zorro Ranch in New Mexico is pretty close to Scientology, a deep underground base for some reason, that has a picture of two overlapping circles forming a Vesica Piscis with two diamonds, which I've speculated, and with a lot of evidence that I'm going to show in this video, dealing with this is the hybridization of two different types of DNA. And we're going to go all into detail. And of course the title, The Serpent Seed, is going to pertain to this in quite a bit of detail. And what happens with me is oftentimes if I'll start to pursue a certain line of research, oftentimes information will just start flooding into me, and that's what's been happening since I made the previous video. This happens not that often. It doesn't happen every single time, but often it marks major pivots with my research, and this is the case with what we're talking about today. So last time we were talking about data storage and how the human biofield it has a capacity for data storage, and one aspect of this is the adaptability of us, and how our environmental things that we would not normally consider important or noteworthy, like electromagnetic fields, sunlight. A lot of people don't consider that to be very important, although it does have a major influence on our hormone production and intelligence level, and the biofield in particular. But yeah, so these non-material things like sunlight, different atmospheric gases like ozone in particular, negative ions, and all these different things have a very important influence on the strength and permeability or robustness of our biofield. And since this is the Spirit War series, I'm going to detail how, what would normally be considered spiritual faculties, telekinesis, psychic phenomena, precognition, different things like that, all pertains to this biofield. And this has been demonstrated a lot in scientists, but again, this is the most coveted area of research. And a lot of the Cold War was really about the competition between the United States, so-called MK Ultra, MK Often, the mind control stuff, but also psychic warfare research, competing with the Czechs and the Russians in particular, who are very interested in something called psychotronics. And again, we're going to come back to these same things. Guess who else was really interested in this? Aleister Crowley. All the secret society orders, including one which we're going to get into briefly today. It was just called the Society of Lizards, coming back to our reptilian theme. But I wanted to talk first in a more general way of this symbolic resonance of the lizard and the reptilian thing. There's tons of disinfo and just retarded research out there about the whole reptilian thing. I don't dismiss it. I just think that because this is such a pivotal issue, that they have to flood the zone with a lot of disinformation about that, and make it seem ridiculous. But let's just start with some basic facts. Like, let's start with the caduceus, for example, the symbol of medicine, which is on a lot of like ambulances and the American Medical Association. So a lot of people may not know that the caduceus is a symbol of two serpents, and there's a very famous story in Greek mythology pertaining to this figure called Tiresias the blind seer. And so basically he offends the gods in some way or other. And so what happens accidentally upon these two snakes copulating, and a lot of worms and reptiles don't have the same type of sexual reproduction as humans, and asexuality in the case of a lot of these worms and things and snails and stuff like that. These more reptoid type creatures have asexual reproduction, and of course they're not mammals, right? So they don't have tits and wombs like humans, and they lay eggs oftentimes. So this is important. We'll come back to that, but let's just say the Tiresias, he happens to disturb these two snakes, and then he transforms from a man into a woman. And you know, arguably a lot of the analysis of that is that, you know, the gods are giving him insight into the difference between the genders, and that he's getting like wisdom out of that and so on. And I think he ends up going blind, but he gets transformed from male to female and then back again. And so this is gonna be important, and we'll come back to that. But let's just say the caduceus has always been associated with medicine, going back to, of course, right near Vatican City in Rome, they have this thing called the Janiculum, which is an island dedicated to the god Janus. But it also has an ancient building there, which was the Temple to Asclepius, the god of medicine, right? So there's always been a connection between snakes and medicine. A lot of people have made a lot of interesting commentary on the fact that the jabby jabs have a lot of snake venom in them, as do a lot of the popular drugs right now, GLP-1 and stuff like that. What do they call it? I forget the trade name of it. It's Ozempic and stuff like that. These weight loss drugs are made out of snake venom. And so, yeah. And so one thing that I want to get into is the connection between humans and reptiles. Like, we're often described as mammals, but we have something that's referred to as the reptilian brain for some reason. And if you've ever had a sunburn and you peel off a layer of your skin, you can look at it up close and see that it looks a lot like scales. And you know, just the way that snakes shed their skin every so often, humans shed their skin too, like if they get a sunburn. So I think that humans are hybrids of reptiles and mammals, for instance. And there's a very interesting reason that I will get into eventually about that. But for now, let's just say when humans are gestating in the womb, they go through a cycle. They start out as like a little tadpole, which again, you're dealing with these amphibian type quasi-reptiles, like this little middle ground between reptiles and mammals, right? The amphibians like frogs and tadpoles, right? So then it grows a little further, but the point is to say that it has this sort of reptilian intermediary form that it goes to in between being like just a little one-celled little zygote, like an egg, and then it gets, so you have the egg, that's the mammalian part potentially, and then the sperm could be the reptilian part. And a lot of people have pointed out that basically if you look at a sperm, it has this little egg-shaped capsule at the end, ovoid if you will, and then it has a little tail like a serpent, and the ovoid part of it becomes our brain, and the tail becomes our spinal column, for instance. So that's very interesting. And again, this gets into the same reason why, you know, we have the so-called Kundalini in Eastern yoga systems and Tantra, and this becomes Salung and Trulkor in the Tibetan system. So again, it's dealing with cultivating the energetic pulsation up and down the spine, the controlled circulation and pumping of the cerebrospinal fluid, for instance. It's very critical to these higher faculties. And so then again, also you're going to see in ancient Egypt, the pharaohs are always depicted. And in fact, the sign of royalty itself is the serpent and the vulture, for instance. So again, you have this you know, different types of animals being so-called hybridized with humans. And of course, the all-seeing eye is related to the serpent goddess, the Wadjet. Again, and of course, Osiris has green skin, which relates both to the fertility of the Nile, but also to the fact that he's an underground reptile. But we won't go into that into too much detail. But let's just say in Egypt, where we see the pyramids, we have all these serpents being revered as the royal protectors of the pharaoh. Is a big serpent. And interestingly, in South America, where we have the pyramids, you got Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. And many say that America is actually named after this Peruvian god Amuru, which is again a winged serpent. So there's something going on with that. And a lot of people have pointed out as well that the original mascot of the United States wasn't the eagle at all. It was the serpent. And you see this old flag that Benjamin Franklin had that says "Join and Die," and it shows these 13 little segments of a serpent. And to me, I don't see any of this as being by accident. We're going to get into a lot of detail and depth around that. But of course, so now we're seeing that this isn't just something made up, right? And it strangely appears all over the world. And when I was reading Joseph Campbell back when I was like 15 or 16, he makes quite a detailed analysis of this, in particular, how all over the world the creation myths are always have this serpent figure, and oftentimes it's an aquatic reptile. That's something we're going to get into more and more as we go on. But now since the Kabbalah and all these Masonic groups are so important in the conspiracyology of our modern times, let's talk about what the Kabbalah says about the serpent, Adam and Eve in the garden. Now, a thing that they don't teach in Sunday school or most of the Christian denominations, but is taught in the Kabbalah, so this is obviously one of their guarded core teachings, is this concept of Samael and Lilith, and how the so-called line of Cain, right, is said to be in the Kabbalah, in their esoteric interpretation of it, not the offspring of Adam and Eve, but actually the offspring of Eve and the serpent. And likewise, Adam has children, you know, with this Lilith, right? So there's these two, okay, and again, one's a serpent, one's a bird. So we could come back to that later. But and so the offspring of, so Lilith is this non-corporeal being, like a ghost almost, or a spirit or demon, if you will. And this goes back, they didn't create that idea. In fact, the word Lilitu goes back to the Sumerians and the Akkadians, and it's an owl goddess, screech owl, who comes in the night and steals the semen of men in their sleep and gives them a wet dream. So it's astrally copulating with the males to produce a race of demons. Okay, and so this is core to the Kabbalah. And I've made previous videos talking about how all Freemasonry really revolves around this hybridization of humanity with the Nephilim. And although in many instances I think this does produce physical offspring, in other instances it's a phenomenon more akin to this like incubus succubus type of concept, where there's some type of copulation between this disembodied discarnate plane and the material plane. So there's like some kind of hybridization between that which happens. And one instance of that would be, you know, what we call possession and so on, which to me I see as being highly prominent within these secret societies for a lot of reasons. That it's taken me a lot of years to really come to that conclusion, because obviously it's kind of woo. It kind of goes outside the realm of our normal speculations and our life experiences. But you know, once you've seen confirmations of certain things over and over again, and you're led down the track and you see there's a completely coherent narrative that connects all these different things, let's just say that I've demonstrated to my own satisfaction that this is a real phenomena. And in my personal life, I've experienced mediumistic spirit possession. I've witnessed it. I haven't luckily personally haven't been party to that, but I've witnessed it in such a way that to me is incontrovertible, that some other intelligence is interfacing with the human biological organism and producing changes that to me can't really be explained any other way. And since, like I've indicated in previous videos, this is a type of mythology, or if you will, folk tales all around the world. This isn't unique to any particular region or any particular religious background. This is something that's completely universal in all human mythology as far as I'm aware. So is that just made up? Why would everybody all around the world come up with that if there wasn't some type of experiential basis for that? So that's what I would tell a person, a skeptical person, which I myself started out that way. But some of the things I'm going to tell today is why I've come to this conclusion more and more firmly. But now, so let's go back and talk about the previous video. I was talking about the human biofield. This comes back into importance. And so if you think, for example, just operating based on the premise that we have something that's called a biofield that's generated by our basic biological functions, that our body generates an electromagnetic field around it, which serves as both a kind of protection for us as well as a basis for various types of what's now considered extra normal capacities. But in reality is really just a function of our nature as a hybrid between an energetic being and a physical being. And so, like I was saying, they have these secret teachings in the Kabbalah which serve as the basis for these different Freemasonic orders and their rites and rituals, in which you are basically working with something that's becomes a resonant cavity for these energetic phenomena, which we call the temple of Solomon, of course, which is based on a double cube, right? And then you get into the fact that the precursor order to the Masonic organization, in my opinion, through decades of research, is they're clearly connected to the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar, in turn, if you really dig and do deep research on that, you're going to come across the idea that they were very influenced by various different heretical groups, not limited to the Sufis, the Druze, the Gnostics and the Ophites in particular. And both of these terms, Gnostics and Ophites, they're both Gnostic groups within the umbrella term of Christianity, which I don't like the terms Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, because I don't really see those things as being different in any way. They're the same, and they're all serpent cults, okay? And they're all sex cults. This is something that modern people are loath to really think about, but it's definitely the truth. They're all serpent cults, and they're all sex cults. And if you're to research these heretical groups like the Gnostics and the Ophites, both of those names pertain to the serpent. Ophite, Ophis in Greek is a word for snake or serpent, and Gnostine is the Hebrew word coming from the Nachash, which is the word that's used to describe the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And so what does the serpent do? He climbs the tree, right? What's the tree? That's the tree of life, right? So that's and of course Adam and Eve surrounding the tree is the genesis and the creation of all life. And the word Chava, which is where we get Eve in Hebrew, is the word for life and living things. Chai or Chaim in Hebrew means living things, and Chava is like a personal pronoun of that same word. So the tree of life, the tree of Eve, right, is entwined by the serpent. And so, and again, we're given this, the rabbinical context of it within the Kabbalah is telling you that there's a hybridization program between Eve and the serpent, which creates what? Cain, or Cain, we call it in English, Cain in Hebrew, relates to two clear words, which is to be downcast. And that's why God all the curses in this part of Genesis are usually related to puns, and all the naming of people is based on puns. And so Cain is given that name, Cain, before he sins, so-called. But look at Cain, the word meaning downcast, right, or low-lying, or something lowly. And that's where we get Cana bush, because it was always grown in the low-lying pasture lands that are near the shore where the boats can dock, because they use it to build ropes and sails for all the boats out of canvas, or so-called cannabis, right? So there's a clear connection there and we still call it cannabis to this day. And a lot of people don't know. Some people will catch on that it has to do with Cana, the Canaanites and the Canaans, but a lot of people don't catch on to the fact that you could call cannabis the bush of Cain, right? So there's a connection there. And so what we're looking at with these groups, the fallen ones, if you will, so that pertains to this word Cain or Cain, and it means fallen ones. That's one clear connected word to that. And so what are these fallen? What does Cain do? He's a fratricidal murderer. Like originally he starts out as a farmer, but then he offers God the non-blood sacrifice of his farm produce, and God's like, hell no, I'm not taking that. You suck. That's basically the story. So Cain gets pissed and he's like, okay, you want a blood sacrifice, and he kills his brother Havel, which means the breath. So in a sense, the breath of Havel, also relating to the word vanity in Hebrew, Havel, or Abel as we call, pertains to the breath. So Havel, or Abel, is a spiritual being, and he's killed by Cain, the fallen serpent. Okay, so they're telling you everything right out in the open, but we're never given the decryption matrix. We're never given the lexicon to explain what these scriptures are really saying. And that's why in the Kabbalah they have to create these 4 different layers of interpretation. You know, the retard level is where we're taught. We're taught at that level, but then there's 4 deeper layers going down to show you all these different levels of interpretation, right? And what I'm telling you as a decrypt, but you know, between Cain and Cain and stuff like that, that's level 1. That would be on level 1 for a Hebrew speaker. So they get a completely different level of interpretation to these things. But what we're looking at is that since the very beginning, there's been a hybridization program between the serpent and the biological mammals, the humans, right? And so I could go way more into depth and detail, but again, as many have pointed out, but few of the common people are aware, is that all the stories in the book of Genesis come from the Enuma Elish and other types of Babylonian, Sumerian, and Canaanite, for that matter, scriptures of that area. That's not original. They didn't create that. God didn't uniquely give that to them. When the so-called patriarchs of the Hebrews were taken into captivity and enslaved by the Babylonians, that's where they got the Kabbalah. That's where they got their scriptures. All come from that. There was no culture before that. That's what they are. And so now, if you assume that as being the case, now you go look at their stories of the Babylonians, and what do they have? So they have this thing called Namu, Nammu, and there's actually one of the descendants in this Adamic bloodline is called Nama, Naamah. So like I said, they always take the names and they just twist them, tweak them a little bit. But in Babylon, where we're fighting a war right now, in Iraq and Iran, there was a city called right, in Iraq, which is where, that's the Tower of Babel. But the goddess of that city was called Namu, and she's the goddess of water. And so in the Bible, where you see God cursing the earth because the Nephilim have been corrupting the genetic seed, and even in the Bible, they say that God preserves Noah and his family because they're the only ones that are pure in all their generations. So that means, and again, coming back to this curse that God lays on the serpent for copulating with Eve, right? He curses him, and he says that there's always going to be enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. So the seed of the serpent is called what? The sons of Cain. Guess who calls themselves the sons of Cain? Freemasons. Hello? And so what is Cain known for? His descendants, like Tubal-Cain and Jubal and Nama, they're the masters of all the artifice and art. So they're architects. They build the first cities as built by Cain in the land of Nod and named after his son Enoch. So there are two Enochs. There's like good Enoch and evil Enoch. So there's Enoch that comes from the line of Seth, so-called seed of the woman, and then there's Enoch on the serpentine side that becomes the basis of the city of Enoch. In my estimation, this is actually what we would call Enki, is closely connected to this. So what do we see? We have this flood myth, and the flood myth, what happens? The Nephilim have hybridized with the human race, and they've corrupted the genetics of all it's in the Bible what it says, something like they sinned against the birds and the fowl and the creatures of the sea and even the plants. All their DNA has been corrupted, much like what we see now with GMOs and chimera hybrid organisms, the spider goats, and they actually have created lots of these types of hybridizations, and people want to still act like there's not cloning right now. But hello, I don't think this is anything new. I don't think this is novel to our modern era whatsoever. And so when we look at these Babylonian myths of Ur-Nammu, the great king of ancient Erech, or Ur, right? Like this Ur-Nammu was the king, and he was named after Namu, the fish goddess. And these Babylonian and Sumerian deities were seen as hybridizing the human race to create a slave race, because they themselves were light-skinned and they couldn't work out in the hot sun in the Fertile Crescent. So they had to create the black-headed people, so-called, what these Babylonians and call themselves. So they're the Anunnaki, really, are these light-skinned. In my opinion, this is what I've come to, is they come from under the earth. They come from a mountainous region with caverns under the earth, which in these different cataclysmic events, such as the flood, which is a periodic event that happens on earth again and again. So during these events, a portion of humanity goes full golem style, just like Golem in Lord of the Rings. They go underground. And of course the word golem, G-O-L-E-M, which is where we get the name of Golem, G-O-L-L-U-M in Lord of the Rings, means an embryo. So when they're creating a golem, like it's not, they want to talk about it like, oh, it's just this magical clay that's turned into a statue. No, golemi in Hebrew is an embryo. Okay, it's an unformed mass of undifferentiated tissue, right? That's shaped by the serpent or by God, and it's imprinted. Just like we can imprint our biofield through our diet and through our environmental conditions and by doing things like chanting mantra or engaging in these yogic postures to reshape and to strengthen and to fortify our bioelectric field, to consciously, willfully imprint on our bioelectric field. Our bioelectric field can also be imprinted by extraneous forces, other beings, if you will, or even by our environment. And this is where we get the fields of epigenetics, metagenetics, and optogenetics, which is where environmental conditions cause our genes to, it's not really mutation necessarily, but it's like the gene expression is tweaked by that. And so not only can this be accomplished, in my opinion, which many will take issue with, but it can be accomplished by non-corporeal entities. And that's what the Masonic rites are all about, in my opinion, is because they're forming pacts and they're using a form of science to gradually acclimate the human being in its normal state to become more susceptible to alteration, modification, and possession by external entities. Now, if you go and read the statements that were made by the son of L. Ron Hubbard, he refers to this very thing, and he refers to it as so-called soul cracking. And according to him, the religion of Scientology was a protracted and extended, attenuated form of Satanism that was just introduced gradually through successive approximation. And as we know, L. Ron Hubbard was a close student and disciple and great admirer of Aleister Crowley, and was very closely associated with Jack Parsons, who was head of the OTO, Ordo Templi Orientis, or Order of the Eastern Templars, who are known to have sex rituals and try to create anal homunculus by putting genetic material of groups of males into the rectum of one of their young initiates to create a hybrid organism. Because a lot of people aren't aware, but this is scientific fact, that if human genetic material in the form of sperm is introduced into a human body, male or female, it doesn't just go away or get pooped out. It embeds itself into the organism, and it can be detected even years later. Paradoxically, it goes up the Kundalini channel and deposits in the brain. And so this is why you hear these stories about the Skull and Bones Club, where they go and they have this coffin ritual initiation where they have a big gangbang and they take the young initiates and they get, you know, sodomized by a large group of people and they have foreign genetic material introduced. And if you were to further speculate that these groups are in fact highly genetically segregated individuals from certain bloodlines and certain families, not only within the Knights Templar, the Freemasonic orders, the various chivalric orders, but also in these modern incarnations such as the Skull and Bones. There's a genetic element to what's being accomplished there. And a lot of people don't know, but Aleister Crowley's organization, the OTO, is actually an offshoot of the Illuminati, which was originally formed in Germany by Karl Kellner, who is a high-level Freemason of these really I mean, there's many different offshoots of the Masonic cults, but some of them are way more occult than others. Like it's a compartmentalization, and of course they have different ones for different types of strata within society. But the so-called alpha lodges are highly genetically oriented, and so when you hear, you know, people like Carl Jung and Aleister Crowley having such common interests, it's because they're both Illuminati people. Crowley heading his own suborder within, descended from the OTO, which in turn was part of the Bavarian Illuminati. Just so, Carl Jung, a lot of people don't know that his family, his father and grandfather, were members of not only the Rosicrucians, but the so-called Illuminati itself, as well as the Egyptian rite of Freemasonry. And so it's no coincidence that people within these organizations rise to an extreme degree of cultural prominence in the figures of people like Aleister Crowley, as well as Ian Fleming, as well as even despite my total admiration and love of Lord of the Rings, I have come to the conclusion that even good old Tolkien was one of these Illuminati bloodlines as well, in these Rosicrucian orders and various things, and he puts a ton of occult material, not limited to the Golem, which I already mentioned, in his work. And his work, again, it's telling you the same story of the Nephilim, who in his work he creates as heroes and calls them the Dunedain, right? These hybridized humans that grow taller and live for hundreds of extra years because they've been hybridized with what they're calling the elves, right? And so there's a lot there to look into. But the concept that I was referring to in the previous video, dealing with biofield data storage is highly relevant to all these occult groups and what they're doing. And now our society has become so occult and so thoroughly dominated. And indeed, the United States, where I live, is completely founded by these occult satanic groups, Sabbatean orders, if you will, such as the Freemasons, the Hellfire Club, which of course Ben Franklin was a member of, Order of the Nine Sisters, which both Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were members of, and Thomas Jefferson himself, through his mother's line, going back to the line of so-called Babylonian exilarchs who were rulers over the area called Rennes-le-Château, which, as many people who are interested in this type of literature may know, is closely aligned to this whole, dragon bloodline thing that deals with, the Merovingians that are the offspring of humans with an aquatic serpent. So this goes all the way back to the most ancient history of humanity. And it's hard to deny when you look and you see this everywhere in South America with the Quetzalcoatl, in the United States with Amaru and all these Osiris, the green underground serpent god of ancient Egypt, being shown through his phallus in the obelisk of the Washington Monument, and the reflecting pool representing Isis, or Namu, the water god, the water serpent goddess. Okay, so like none of this is an accident. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a coincidence. And even if you don't believe in these types of spiritual realities, you have to contend with the fact that our leaders believe in that, and they're engaging in ritual behavior on a daily basis, and that every institution within our government, like NASA, named after the Nahash, the deceiving serpent, which its logo is this little red forked serpent tongue, looks like a little chevron. NASA, or the NSA, if you will, and again the Nazis, or the Nassines, Templars, right, or were derived from the Ophites and the Nassines, which were a serpent cult within Gnosticism. And so there's quite a bit, and even Moses, right, using the serpent staff, and even Metatron being named after the pillar of the serpent staff, and the fire that guides the Hebrews through the wilderness, and the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke. This is all plasma tech. This is all serpent tech. And the serpent, in addition to being a biological organism and a non-corporeal intelligence, also the serpent has been used since the days of ancient Egypt as a symbol of wave propagation. If you look at a sine wave and you look at the little sidewinding serpent, that's telling you something in and of itself, is that all this is highly connected to the energetic domain. And just as in the previous video I was telling you about biofield data encryption and dealing with electromagnetism as a key functionality of our human biology, we see the serpent is always going to be present, whether it be internally with our kundalini or externally with these sinusoidal electromagnetic wave propagation that's influencing all aspects of our physiology. So these are all important things to know, and by being armed with this information, you can begin to form a type of spiritual defense and offense in the realm of spirit war. But you have to acknowledge the reality of this domain of interaction, and you have to transcend the slave materialism that we've been given. Because what better way to oppress people with invisible technology and energy weapons and directed energy weapons and all these kinds of things, energetic mind control, electromagnetic mind control. What more effective way to accomplish that than to have people be totally ignorant of that? And so as a counteracting process of that, we're teaching the spirit war. We're teaching people how to empower yourselves with this type of knowledge. And of course, this is just the building block to get you there, because before I could even introduce any type of defensive or offensive measures based on this technology, you have to understand the core concepts of it and acknowledge the importance and the prominence of this and the all-pervasive nature of this throughout human mythology since the very, very beginning. And once you're given this little skeleton key of knowledge and you're decoded the symbolic paradigm, you can find it everywhere in human culture. And once you get that key, and once you recognize that you're being completely surrounded by this occult initiatory content everywhere, you're being subconsciously programmed with all this information through fiction, through symbolism and mythology. But as long as it remains on the subconscious level, and you're not analyzing it on a rational basis, on a conscious analytical basis, it's programming you to accept it as a passive role, as it's passively entering into your subconscious without rational knowledge or consent. And so in order to be armed against that, you need to be educated about what that is. And so that's what we're doing in the Spirit War series. And like I said, all these 117 videos are just introductory. There's so much more and there's so much deeper to go. And really the only reason why I haven't gone much deeper is because I'm not really seeing much in the way of, you know, correspondence with people that's showing their comprehension of what I'm telling, or their necessity, you know, understanding that this is in fact, you know, needed and necessary, and to demonstrate, you know, the audience's comprehension of what I'm saying, you know, because I find it would be futile to go deeper unless there's some kind of basic level of comprehension. So that's what I'm trying to establish, and I'm hoping, even if now this doesn't reach the people who have a comprehension of this and the importance of it, that I'm just putting it out there, you know, and as building blocks. And who knows, a lot of things on the internet tend to become semi-permanent. So maybe someday, somewhere, some people will store and retain this information on which to build, you know, the edifice of much greater comprehension and the basic analysis that allows a proactive involvement with this type of knowledge and information. And again, as I've emphasized many times, this is not new information, okay? This is known to a wide variety of people who, because of this oppressive structure in which we exist, they have to remain kind of silent and secret. But this is known, and of course, due to the power of this information, it's often kept secret because it could do harm in the wrong hands. But in my point of view is that it's already in the wrong hands, and the wrong hands are, if they have a monopoly on this information and they're the only ones that are out there trying to teach and share this information, then the only available version of it is going to be their approved version. And so in order to fight against that, I'm induced the Spirit War series, and I'm hoping that this is going to have a positive effect. Stay tuned for part 118 coming soon.